You ever watch public television? It's probably our favorite channel since we dumped to cable. And I especially enjoy shows that connect the dots of history. There was a special that we enjoyed for quite a while ago now called Connections. Well, today we're going to do one of those, Connect the Dots, an exploration of the song, O Come, Emmanuel. This is O Come, Emmanuel. It's a strange Christmas carol. It's much different than the other ones. It sounds interesting. So today we're going to find out what it's praying for, where it came from, and what it means to us. Here's what the song is praying for. You remember that the great King Solomon had two sons, and they split off. Well, I don't know if they were two sons, but they split off into Judah and Israel, two warring countries. Ahaz was from the house of David, king of Judah, and he was fighting with Israel and Aram Damascus, who had joined together to attack Judah. They were his two enemies. So now, I want us to read the prophecy about Emmanuel. It's in Isaiah 7, and we're going to start with verse 13. Isaiah said, "Listen, house of David, is it not enough for you to try the patience of men? Will you also try the patience of my God? Therefore, the Lord himself will give you a sign. The virgin will conceive, have a son, and name him Emmanuel. By the time he learns to reject what is bad and choose what is good, he will be eating butter and honey. For before the boy knows how to reject what is bad and choose what is good, the land of the two kings you dread will be abandoned." That, of course, is then Israel and Aram Damascus will be abandoned. "The Lord will bring on you, your people, and the house of your father, such a time has never been since Ephraim separated from Judah." Ephraim, another name for Israel. "The king of Israel, the king of Assyria is coming." That's why it's all red around that slide. Assyria was the impending empire. Look at that phrase, "the king of Assyria is coming." Note these pictures. It looks too familiar to us today because of Daesh and what they've been doing. We got heads chopped, and then they're in a pile, and they're counting them. Can you believe it? That's the Assyrians. Well, when you see the king of Assyria is coming, it really has two connotations. In Kings and Chronicles, you read that Ahaz had these two enemies, and he was afraid of them, and he wanted to have the big empire Assyria come and help him out. And so he called to them. And so when he heard they were coming, he would think, good, they'll come and destroy my enemies. But look more closely. If he looked more closely at what Isaiah said, he would find that Assyria would not be just interested in destroying his enemies. They would come for him as well. They would have struck terror into his heart because his people would be destroyed. The Assyrians were known for severe cruelty. Again, it sounds familiar. The Assyrians were a nightmare, just as Daesh is today. So in this prophecy, God is warning Ahaz that instead of salvation that he's expecting, the Assyrians are going to bring terror. But here's the interesting part. Embedded in this prophetic warning of disaster on the house of David is this prophecy, Isaiah 7:14. "Therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. The virgin will conceive, have a son, and name him Emmanuel." So within this prophecy of terror, God has placed a promised son named Emmanuel, which means God with us. God is with us. Now, you notice the word virgin there. It says a son will be born to a virgin. There's some debate about this word virgin, because in the original Hebrew language, the word in verse 14 is actually young woman. So some people say this has nothing to do with the Messiah coming. It was talking about some royal mother. But the ancient Hebrews translated their own scriptures into Greek. And when they translated this word, they translated it into the Greek word for virgin. So they knew there was more to this prophecy than just a child born to somebody in the royal house of Ahaz. They used the Greek word for virgin to translate the Hebrew word for young woman. Okay, so this translation then, that called the Septuagint, this was the Bible of the New Testament writers. They noticed this word in the prophecy, of course. And in fact, I think that Jesus taught them this, because he worked his way through the Bible, teaching them all the things that pointed to himself as Messiah, and he would have pointed this one out as well. They knew this child represented the final victory of God. The Son is God with us, Immanuel, the messianic child, born to a virgin to the royal house of David, and not simply to some woman in the house of Ahaz at the time of the prophecy. This child would indeed save his people, but not just from physical enemies. It would save his people from sin itself. The Messiah figure, though, wasn't a new idea. For centuries, there had been this expectation that God himself would come to live in and among his people. When did that expectation start? And why did it start? Well, that has to bring us back to Moses in Egypt and the Hebrews in slavery. They longed for God to redeem them, and after 400 years, God did come, but it took 400 years, almost twice the length of time our country's been in existence, that God wasn't there. But then he came in the person of Moses and released them from their captivity. But it wasn't just Moses. God came with them too in person. God was with them as they journeyed through the barren wilderness full of wild animals and disease and enemies. God fought their battles, provided food for them and water for a huge multitude in miraculous ways. He constantly delivered his people. That was Emmanuel in the desert. Before he died, Moses assured them that one like him would come again, bringing God to dwell amongst his people again. And that's when the Messiah idea began, I believe. So throughout the history, whenever Israel ran into trouble and were enslaved, they would remember those days back in the desert when their ancestors would cry out for Emmanuel, Messiah, and the Israelites would cry out again to deliver them. We read this longing prayer all through the Old Testament. The same sense of God, come live with us. This Christmas song we're looking at is a lament like that. Almost like the book of Lamentations. I found some laments I was going to have us read, but I thought it was going to take too long. But they're all through there. This O come, Emmanuel would have been something like what they sang back then. Ransom captive Israel. So the longing for God continued for centuries, and yet God didn't come. And in fact, Ezekiel says that God left the temple. He wasn't even in the country anymore. Wasn't in the temple. He was gone. Then Isaiah and his fellow prophet Micah promised again that the Messiah would come. Micah says this in Micah 5:2-5. Bethlehem Ephrathah, you are small among the clans of Judah. One will come from you to be ruler over Israel for me. His origin is from antiquity, from eternity. Therefore, he will abandon them until the time when she who was in labor has given birth. That's a scary thought. So he abandoned them again. Then the rest of his brothers will return to the people of Israel. He will stand and shepherd them in the strength of Yahweh, in the majestic name of Yahweh his God. They will live securely, for then his greatness will extend to the ends of the earth. He will be their peace. That's what Micah said. And the writers of the New Testament, of course, they knew who that one was. They knew who this child was. He was the Messiah, Jesus. So Matthew quotes from Micah, and this is very familiar at Christmas. Matthew 2, 1-6. After Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea in the days of King Herod, wise men from the east arrived unexpectedly in Jerusalem, saying, "Where is he who was born King of the Jews? For we saw his star in the east and have come to worship him." When King Herod heard this, he was deeply disturbed, and all Jerusalem with him. So he assembled all the chief priests and the scribes of the people, who knew the scriptures, remember, knew Isaiah and Micah, and asked them where this Messiah would be born. "In Bethlehem of Judea," they told him, "because this is what was written in the prophet, 'And you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the leaders of Judah, because out of you will come a leader who will shepherd my people Israel.'" So Messiah came, and they killed him. And in 70 AD, their temple religion and their nation were destroyed. But the promise to Israel remains. Messiah came and will come again. He still lives, though. He still lives on earth now. He lives this time within his people by the Holy Spirit. But the world still reels in turmoil, wars and rumors of wars, man's inhumanity to man. We still long for a Savior. We turn to this, we turn to that, all sorts of things, guns, ammunition, bombs, alliances, all sorts of things, just like Ahaz was trying to do. He thought the Assyrians would save him. Instead, the Assyrians enslaved them once again, and a lot of what we try to do enslaves us. And you get stuck in stuff that you can't get out of. We are not who we should be. We are not at peace as a country and as a people within ourselves. We still sing the lament, Veni, Veni, Immanuel. So, that's what the prayer is praying for. That's what the song is praying for. Now, where did it come from? You notice something about that song that's different than other Christmas carols? It's because the text is in Latin and started back in medieval times. It was a set of Latin verses called the O antiphons, or they reduced it to the O's. It was performed in monasteries in the days before Christmas Eve. Each of the antiphons refers to one of the titles of the Messiah, like Wisdom, the Lord of Might, the Rod of Jesse, Day Spring, the Key of David, and Emmanuel. Then in the early 19th century, an Anglican priest named John Mason Neale, who could write and speak over 20 languages. He was interested in poetic beauty and medieval culture and founded a children's home and a home for former prostitutes and all this thing. In his spare time, he was doing this exploration, and he enjoyed translating hymns and carols from many languages into English. And in 1851, he read the O antiphons, the text to this song, in an ancient book of hymns. And he translated those words from Latin into English, and this English translation that we sing retains the same meter as the Latin did. The tune sounds the way it does because of its origin in the 15th century. He found this tune in another book, and he wrote it in his book, The Hymnal Noted. This is where he put a bunch of these songs. He copied this melody from the French Franciscan nuns who used it as a processional for their funerals. That's where the tune came from. And he put the two together. So we celebrate the days before Christmas with anticipation and too high expectations sometimes. And yet even in the middle of all that, these words remind us that Christians also continue to long for peace. And so this lament is applicable to us, because in our world, where the news brings tragedy and loss into our own living rooms, on our screens and newspapers from around the whole world, we long for peace as well. In our own hearts, well, we disappoint ourselves. We're not who we should be. And we lament. And sometimes we even hurt those we love. We hurt them in word and deed and often feel terrible about it. We lament. We long for wholeness and we long for peace. We long for a time when the Messiah will come and cast down the arrogant and wipe away the tears from the sorrowing. We long for another country, our true home with God. We want him to come again and set things right. And we sing, O come, Emmanuel. And he has come, and he will come again to take us home, but for now, he lives in our hearts. Let's bring his presence into our dark world. Not only at Christmas, but whenever and wherever we can see that love is needed and that we can bring it. We bring his presence, you know. Do you remember Mr. Rogers? Did you know that he was a Christian pastor? Presbyterian. And he still preaches to us today. He once said, "When I was a boy and I would see scary things in the news, my mother would say to me, 'Look for the helpers.' You will always find people who are helping." Like Moses, we too can bring Emmanuel to our world. What a privilege. You can bring God into your world. Won't you be a neighbor?